Welcome to Embracing the Difference Globally, the Ability event. Session 6 will begin shortly. I'd like to just take a moment to thank our partners this year. Rehabilitation Counseling Program from St. Cloud State University, St. Cloud State University Special Education Department, Hamlin University, Metropolitan State University, and Normandale Community College.
And developed 6 videos on the topic. And as David said, I'm currently president of the U.S. International Council on Disabilities. For those of you in the rehab business, I was also Deputy Commissioner of Rehabilitation for a while when I was in Washington. My last position ended a year ago, and I was director of the Center on Disability Studies at the University of Hawaii. Currently, I'm serving on 4 boards of directors, writing a memoir, operating Left Brain Art Studio at Etsy.com, raising money for nonprofits, and maintaining a blog, which some of you may be familiar with, called We Can Do This If We Try, .blogspot.com. Over 1 billion people with disabilities would benefit if every country ratified the CRPD. So far, only 182 countries have done so. 7 countries have taken no action, and 9 have not yet ratified it. The U.S. is among that 9. Okay, that I think that's enough for an introduction, right?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Morrissey. Well, you have definitely had a lot of roles in the past, and then definitely been a very important figure when it comes to like the issue with like disability. So we cannot wait to have more discussion with you. So like you mentioned earlier, U.S. is among one of the 9 countries who has yet ratified the CRPD. And then for the last few sessions, we spent a lot of time talking about why this might be an issue, and then what are some of the actions we can take to ensure that we're pushing for the ratification. So today we decided to take on a slightly different approach. Instead of telling you all why it's not ratified, we decided to look on some specific articles in the CRPD. So all of us can have some ideas why it's important and what aspect of life it has an impact on people with disabilities. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So we're going to start with Article 7, entitled "Children with Disabilities," and I'm going to kind of zoom in a bit on this room. Okay. All right, thank you, Nick. So I'm going to read it out loud real quick, and then we can have some discussion. So Article 7, Children with Disabilities. Point 1, states parties shall take all necessary measures to ensure the full enjoyment by children with disabilities of all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children. Number 2, in all actions concerning children with disabilities, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. And point 3, states parties shall ensure that children with disabilities have the right to express their views freely on all matters affecting them, their views being given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity, on an equal basis with other children, and to be provided with disability and age-appropriate assistance to realize that right. So Dr. Morrissey, what is your take on that?
Well, first I'd like to give a little bit of background before we get to the details so I can answer your question. I was a member of the U.S. delegation when the treaty was being developed, when I worked for the federal government. And I think it's helpful for all the folks involved today to have a sense of what the tensions were in the UN with regard to content. You had developing and developed countries. So that was one distinction. Developed countries wanted less detail because that way they wouldn't have to change too many things or indicate what things they had concerned about when they submitted their ratification package to the UN. You had the developing countries where advocates were really pushing for a lot of detail because they wanted to make sure they could hold their governments responsible. So that was one set of tensions. Then you had another set of tensions between the conservative and less conservative countries. So, for example, in places like Germany, the Arab countries, some countries in South America, you would have a strong commitment to protecting children above and beyond everything else. That was probably true also of some other countries in Scandinavia. So children in these countries had almost a sacred status that almost superseded that of their parents. And then you had countries where, like in the US, where up until somebody's 18, the parents are in charge. So you had tensions like that. Then you also had tensions that between countries that had money and countries that didn't have money. So any specificity or any specific obligations that would be introduced in the statements or the articles had the effect of raising the dollar signs. So you had countries with money not wanting to be too demanding because then they'd have to shell out money to help other countries with less money implement. So all these things came into play and affected how many words and what words ended up on the page. Another thing that's useful to know, and other speakers may have addressed this, is that at the UN, and you saw it most recently with the climate conference, there are no votes on things. You just keep talking until you reach consensus. So that could be a freaking nightmare, because for some topics they can take forever. Now, another general comment I'll make is that it's interesting that in the treaty, you have an article specific to children and an article specific to women. That's because in both cases, we have out there a treaty on women and a treaty on children adopted by the UN. The US, just as a matter of fact, has not ratified either of those yet either. So what that tells us is that children and women in many places around the world are more vulnerable than other populations, and we need to be more specific, and we need to highlight those types of people so that we can protect them and maybe create new opportunities for them. Okay, now my take on this article. The reason why I suggested this article to David was because this was one of the major stumbling blocks with regard to the US ratifying the treaty in 2014, the last time it was considered. You need 67 Senate votes for ratification, and the last attempt we fell 5 short. And one of the most well-funded, most vocal groups in opposition to the treaty and ratification in the United States was the National Homeschoolers Association. This group came out of nowhere. They were heavily financed by the Koch brothers, 2 very conservative people. And I think they were given $10 million to mount a campaign against ratification. And what was driving them bonkers was basically paragraph 2 of Article 7, which I'll repeat that again for you. In all actions concerning children with disabilities, the best interest of the child should be a primary consideration. They didn't like the idea that the UN would tell us what to do. They felt that if we ratified the treaty, that basically the government, quote unquote, and possibly the UN would tell parents whether they could or could not educate their children at home, and they didn't like that. And they saw no way that we could put in our ratification package a carve out that would allow that to happen. Now, as a practical matter, and this is connected to the Constitution and federalism, the federal government does not tell states or parents how to educate children with disabilities. That's a state responsibility to guide how people are educated. So as a practical matter, the federal government wouldn't be in the business of doing something on behalf of the UN because of our Constitution. It doesn't allow it. So what states typically do, and they're all different, is parents have total control over their kids till they're 18, unless they abuse their children or neglect their children or in some other way harm their children. And states do not take on, as part of that protection, telling them how they have to educate their kids. So parents can do what they want. And I think an interesting aside is that now with COVID and more parents having taken on homeschooling in one form or another, does that mean that the National Homeschooling Association has a much broader constituency than it had before, and that would work to our benefit? Or, have they developed all these converts that will even make our job harder the next time we attempt ratification? I don't know the answer to that question. Now, if the Senate did ratify the CRPD at some point in time, nothing would happen with regard to what a parent is allowed to do in terms of educating their child at home. And so, it's hard for me to figure out what they're afraid of in that circumstance. Now, what triggered this whole uplifting or uprising among parents who homeschooled was a situation that developed concerning a family from Germany. They fled to the United States in 2008, and they had, I think, 5 children, and they had homeschooled their children. In Germany, there is a law that says everybody has to go to school, period. And so if you don't allow your kids to go to school, you would go to jail and your children would be taken away from you. So they came here, everything was fine for a while, and then their visas ran out and it was time for them to go back. And they objected on the basis of if they went back, they'd go to jail. And so they were threatened with prosecution. The Obama administration decided not to prosecute. I went on the web yesterday to see what else was out there since that point in time. And the last thing I could find was in 2019, President Trump said that they had to leave the country in 12 months. I don't think that happened, but that was the last thing I could find on the web. Well, you can imagine what the homeschooler lobbying unit did with that one. They're saying, see, what's going to happen is parents are going to go to jail in the United States. That's going to be really bad. We can't have that happen. So the key thing is that what happened in July of 2014 may help the next time we attempt ratification. Senator Barrasso of Wyoming added an amendment to the ratification package that was adopted that basically said nothing in the convention, which is the treaty, limits the rights of parents to homeschool their children. It's very specific. So that will never be, that would never be undone then. And so with regard to that matter, I think, we're in relatively good shape if people pay attention to the content.
Thank you for that thorough response, Dr. Morrissey. I think you definitely brought up an interesting point that I think many of us were not aware, is that homeschool play a big factor in this decision making. It sounds like the US parents have almost total control of the child before they turn 18. And then many of them would like to have them go to, just like send them to the homeschool. But I think under the ratification of the child piece means that all the children have to go to just like a state public or private school, and maybe that triggers some fear. Parents just, oh, I don't have control for my children anymore, or if I choose to have my child remain homeschool, that can lead to some like trouble for the family. Is that kind of what's going on in this case?
Yes.
Wow, interesting. Okay, thank you so much for that insight. Oh, and for those who are attending online, I'm sorry I forgot to mention earlier, if at any point during the discussion you have questions or comments, please feel free to like send it in the chat box, and then we will like address that later on. Thank you. Okay, and so now I'm thinking let's go on to the next piece that you recommended, which is Article 8, awareness raising. So I'm going to read them again. So point 1, states parties undertake to adopt immediate, effective, and appropriate measures. A, to raise awareness throughout society, including at the family level, regarding persons with disabilities, and to foster respect for the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. B, to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices relating to persons with disabilities, including those based on sex and age in all areas of life. C, to promote awareness of the capabilities and contributions of persons with disability. Number 2, measures to this end include A, initiating and maintaining effective public awareness campaigns design. And then under that, number 1, to nurture receptiveness to the rights of persons with disabilities. Number 2, to promote positive perceptions and greater social awareness towards persons with disabilities. Number 3, to promote recognitions of the skills, merits, and abilities of persons with disabilities and of their contributions to the workplace and the labor market. B, fostering at all levels of the education system, including in all children from an early age, an attitude of respect for the rights of persons with disabilities. C, encouraging all organs of the media to portray persons with disabilities in a manner consistent with the purpose of the present convention. And D, promoting awareness training programs regarding persons with disabilities and the rights of persons with disabilities. So Dr. Morrissey, can you give us some insight on that specific article, please?
Sure. As it's been a while. It was like, 2006 the last time that I was at the, UN. But I think that this article, there was a lot of support for it, and that people recognized, regardless of what cluster they were in, with regard, preferences, everybody thought this is a good idea and should be included. They also felt that that it would be a great instrument to promote disability rights if you saw positive stories about people with disabilities in all types of media, and that people made an affirmative commitment to start doing that. Now, if you look, as you look at that article, a couple of things stand out. Families are emphasized, and education is emphasized. So what that tells you is that they see the families as having a responsibility to viewing their family member with a disability in a positive context. And in many countries, that's not the case. You know, they think that if they end up with a child with a disability, that they're being punished by God. You know, that's the way it is in some countries. Or that the child has to be hidden away, or the child has to be given away, or the child has to be institutionalized. So they recognize the importance of bringing the family in to the process of making sure society sees people with disabilities in a positive light. The second thing is in education. In many countries, children with disabilities are not being educated, period. So, you know, again, they emphasize that context so that that would become a place where people make efforts. They saw, obviously, because of the article itself, media is playing a central role in making good things happen. And they also acknowledge that people need training. If you don't systematically go about the business of training, then even the best efforts through media and through families and education won't be enough. You've got to really systematically educate people about the need to recognize the rights of people with disabilities and to consider them as an equal member of society. Now, what you see throughout all these articles that deal with people and with certain obligations, specific obligations, is they address what. They do not address how to do it or how much. And that was, that again was a reflection of the effort to get to a consensus on a particular article and to not be too prescriptive, because then developed countries would have to maybe redo or undo some of the things they already were doing. And so they won on that respect. But if you look at US law also often gives examples of what you have to do, says what you have to do, but does allow a lot of flexibility in how you go about doing it. So I think that's an acceptable thing to do in a, say, a conceptual context. One final observation I'll make: in I guess the late 1990s, the HHS funded a rather large project to try and highlight positive stories about people with disabilities in print media. And that was funded for 3 years, and it did a lot. It did a lot, but that was the only systematic effort that I can recall at that point on that effort, and it didn't seem to generate too much by anybody else in terms of replication. Now, what's going on, which is really interesting, I have two observations. If you look at TV commercials, you see a lot more diversity in commercials with regard to every category but disability. So I think when we start to see all kinds of people with disabilities on ads, in ads, then I think we'll have an indicator that we're making progress in that regard. In the area of motion picture development, they are really being proactive. They have, I think they have a set of principles on the topic. They want to proactively include people with disabilities in all aspects of film development. And so if you go onto the website for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, I think it's not arts, no, of film, whatever that is, the American Academy, you know, the guys who do the Academy Awards, that organization, they have a lot of stuff on there. And I have a niece who's in the movie business, and she is very aware of what's expected. Like, for example, if you have a role for a person who is a wheelchair user in a movie now, everybody knows the expectation is you actually get a person who uses a wheelchair to play that part. And so I think that's a positive development. So that's all I have to say about that one.
Yeah, thank you for the insight, Dr. Morrissey. So it just still seems like we need to have more like exposure or like representatives from the community with disabilities on TV and on commercials. It seems like you mentioned that back in the 90s, there was a push for more representatives on TV from that community, but it seems like it did not sparkle a lot of like movements or like actual like things happen. And with right now, you're still pushing for more representatives on TV. But I'm just wondering, like, besides that, because like you mentioned, one concern parents have with the ratification of the CRPD is that if they keep their children at home school, they'll get in trouble. But you mentioned that the Senator of Wyoming actually added an amendment to prevent the parents from getting in trouble, so to speak. But I'm just wondering that so with all these contents coming up with like the ratification, what are some good ways to get the information out? And then what are some good ways to like really have the general public know what the CRPD is about?
I think one of the failures in 2013 and 2014 was that we didn't mount an effective grassroots campaign. I think that many people either didn't know about it, or if they did know about it, they say, well, we really don't need to do this because we have the Americans with Disabilities Act and other legislation. So it's not a big deal. And that's really short-sighted because first off, if you're not part of the group, and the group being the UN, that means with regard to this topic, if you don't ratify, you can't sit on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of the UN, which directs and collects reports on countries every year, and basically whatever they get, and they talk a lot to civil society when they do these reports. You can't influence, if you're not sitting on that committee or have an opportunity to sit on that committee, then you're not influencing the kinds of questions that the committee asks countries or civil society in those countries, or have any way to influence the text of the reports, or to benefit from the deliberations that occur in preparing reports, and you're kind of left out. And so if you don't have a seat at decision-making tables with regard to the UN, then you become less and less of a player in many other respects. For example, traveling overseas, everybody benefits from accessibility, obviously, Americans and everybody else who have disabilities. And what is happening now, since we're in a very small group that have not yet ratified, is that countries are turning to countries that have ratified the treaty, especially China, believe it or not, to get technical assistance and support, and to do the right things with regard to accessibility. And that leaves us out. That leaves us out in two respects. One, we have less influence, and two, we are eliminating a possibility for our companies to benefit in making money. And so we have to think of the big picture and not think in a limited way. And then the other general observation I would make is that there are things in the treaty that we're not going to talk about today. Voting, participating in the political process, that means running for office, and supported decision-making. These are things that were given a lot of attention at the UN, and the words in those articles is very, very important foundational material. And right now, with regard to all three of those things, everything is driven by state decisions and state law. If nothing else, if we ratified the treaty, we would create a reason for us to have a conversation about, okay, what are some general principles on supported decision-making that we can all agree on, and we encourage states to adopt them? Or do we need a national law with regard to certain things connected to supported decision-making, connected to rights? Because the Constitution allows the federal government to deal with the topic of rights, or voting or something else. So that's another area where I think the UN could help us. Now you can say, well, we can still look at the UN now to get ideas to improve the situation in those three cases. But I think it would be more powerful and have more energy if we ratified it.
So it seems like there's a sort of a power struggle when it comes to the federal government and the state government in this topic. And then you also brought up an interesting point that whenever a discussion about the ratification of CRPD happens, it's on a high level sort of meeting. Like you need to be on a certain level to enter that conversation. And then you were also saying that there's a lack of like grassroots movements from just like, like the everyday common people who care about this issue. So if in that case, I would like to ask you just like, what is your recommendations for people who are on a grassroots level trying to bring more awareness of the CRPD to the general public?
Well, I think that people don't recognize how much power they have with senators. And having worked for the Senate, I know this is a fact. What I recommend is that every state, and I think Minnesota, especially your self-advocates organization in Minnesota, I don't recall what the name of it is, but they were very active with regard to the CRPD and 13 and 14. They may still be. But I think it's very important that every state develop a grassroots group that focuses on the treaty and educates senators about why it's important to them, especially if you have a senator who's on the Foreign Relations Committee, because that's where it's going to be considered first. And it has to be reported out of that committee before it's considered by the full Senate. And you say, well, senators are really busy. They don't have, who's going to pay attention to a letter or an email or anything else I send in. And that's not, you shouldn't think that way, because the minute you hit the number 10 emails, 10 letters, 10 phone calls, all of a sudden something is elevated. And it ends up in a different category. So it becomes more important to senior staff in the office and ultimately to the senator as well. The other thing is that senators do listen to national organizations, but only to a certain point. They want to know, they want this message they're getting from a national organization to be verified or reinforced by their constituents. And if their constituents don't tell them it's important, then they're not going to pay attention to it.
Thank you for that, Dr. Morrissey. So I think you brought up a very encouraging point, just that sometimes we don't realize how much power we truly have, because we're just one individual. If I give that call, I write an email, it's not going to change much. Like you mentioned that sometimes all we need is just 10 individuals like-minded who bug our senators and our congressmen. And when enough people contact them with the same issue, then it becomes a little more serious and elevated. So I guess it's just like we still need to find that like-minded individuals and group together and work together towards this common goal. Thank you. And so the ability event is hosted by the Rehabilitation Studies graduate program at St. Cloud State University. And then many of us who are attending today are students from that program. And we also have like individuals working in the rehab business joining us today. So you have chosen a piece that focuses specifically on the rehab. And I think that is a good segue for our next discussion. So let me scroll down all the way to Article 26. And it's on rehabilitation and rehabilitation. So I'm going to read it out loud real quick and we can have more discussion on that. So number one, it says that states parties shall take effective and appropriate measures, including through peer support, to enable persons with disabilities to attain and maintain maximum independence for physical, mental, social, and vocational ability, and full inclusion and participations in all aspects of life. To that end, states parties shall organize, strengthen, and extend comprehensive habilitation and rehabilitation services and programs, particularly in the areas of health, employment, education, and social services, in such way that these services and programs, A, begin at the earliest possible stage and are based on the multidisciplinary assessment of individual needs and strength. B, support participation and inclusion in the community and all aspects of society, are voluntary and are available to persons with disabilities as close as possible to their own communities, including in rural areas. 2, states parties shall promote the development of initial and continuing training for professionals and staff working in habilitation and rehabilitation services. 3, states parties shall promote the availability, knowledge, and use of assistive devices and technologies designed for persons with disabilities as they relate to habilitation and rehabilitation. So Dr. Morrissey, what is your take on that specific article?
I think this one is a good one to illustrate a key point in the overall drafting, and that is that if you notice in the awareness article, there was no use of the verb shall. No, shall is usually associated with you better do it or else, a mandate. In this one, you see that, shall is used a lot. It's like, this is not something we like you to do, you have to do it. So I think that's a key point. It also reflects that everybody was interested in this article and felt that it was important. I remember that was especially important to countries that had a high instances of people becoming disabled because of violence or war or conflict. And, the whole landmine issue was still an issue back then. And the consequences of people losing their limbs because of hitting a landmine when they're walking around. There was a lot to like in putting this one in, and not much objection, but there are some implications that I'd like to share with you. If you notice, it doesn't deal with the issue of separation from home. So you could still have people being rehabilitated or habilitated in institutions. I think it was a plus to have the reference to as early, whenever, you need to provide habilitation, rehabilitation at the earliest possible age. So that was a plus. The training of professionals, that was especially important to developing countries because they don't have OTs, PTs, speech therapists. So, you need somebody who knows how to help somebody learn how to talk or walk or wash dishes. And so these were really basic things that people wanted reflected in the text. What I thought was especially important, and we slipped it in, I think, at the end, is if you notice in the very first part of the article, peer support was put in. Peer support is especially important in any situation with any person with a disability. If they can see somebody like themselves being successful, being independent, helping others, being valued, that is worth $1 million. And so peer support is especially important in the habilitation and rehabilitation process. This article, I don't think, took a lot of time, but the items that were the issue was, whether you were or were not going to deal with institutionalization in the context of this article. The final argument that was made was, well, look, you don't look at these articles in isolation. If you look in other places, we deal with the issue of people being maintained and included in the community. So, that's where you look for that guidance. You don't need to look for it here. The issue about how you do it and how much you have to do to satisfy your compliance with treaty, again, was not focused on. But I think that's about all I have to say about that one.
Thank you for that, Dr. Morrissey. I think it's definitely important that as individuals working in a rehab services, we understand what the needs for the people with disabilities are, whether they are looking for education services, employment services, or just simply to achieve independent living. And I think you also brought up a great point regarding the peer support, because sometimes if one individual with disability sees others with disability who are able to achieve the level of independence that they have throughout the rehabilitation services, it can definitely boost their interest and confidence in the service. Thus, it can also push the whole development of this of this industry. So I think when we also, from the earlier discussion, we also talked about how employment and education are two of the very important aspects when it comes to people with disability, and it's also an important resources for them to achieve independent living. So the last piece that you recommended us to look is actually focusing on employment. So I'm just going to pull it up one more time. So Article 27 focuses specifically on work and employment. And then on number 1, states parties recognize the right of persons with disabilities to work on an equal basis with others. This includes the right to the opportunity to gain a living by work freely chosen or accepted in a labor market and work environment that is open, inclusive, and accessible to persons with disabilities. States parties shall safeguard and promote the realization of the right to work, including for those who acquire a disability during the course of employment, and taking appropriate steps, including through legislation to, inter alia, A, prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability with regard to all matters concerning all forms of employment, including conditions of recruitment, hiring and employment, continuance of employment, career advancement, and safe and healthy working conditions. B, protect the rights of persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others to just and favorable conditions of work, including equal opportunities and equal remuneration for work of equal value, safe and healthy working conditions, including protection from harassment and the redress of grievances. C, ensure that persons with disabilities are able to exercise their labor and trade union rights on an equal basis with others. D, enable persons with disabilities to have effective access to general technical and vocational guidance programs, placement services, and vocational continuing training. E, promote employment opportunities and career advancement for persons with disabilities in the labor market, as well as assistance in finding, obtaining, maintaining, and returning to employment. F, promote opportunities for self-employment, entrepreneurship, the development of cooperatives, and starting one's own business. G, employ persons with disabilities in public sector. H, promote the employment of persons with disabilities in the private sector through appropriate policies and measures, which may include affirmative action programs, incentives, and other measures. I, ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided to persons with disabilities in the workplace. J, promote the acquisition by persons with disabilities of work experience in the open labor market. K, promote vocational and professional rehabilitation, job retention, and return to work programs for persons with disabilities. And 2, states parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities are not held in slavery or servitude and are protected on an equal basis with others from forced or compulsory labor. So this is definitely a lot of like the treaties that protects the rights of people with disabilities when they enter the work market. So Dr. Morrissey, what do you think this means?
Those of you who are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, employment, can see a lot of parallels between some of this text and that. So those of us who were involved in the development of the ADA were involved in drafting this article. But some of the things that I think are worth highlighting, one general and then the rest a little more specific, are these. If you notice throughout this, they say equal basis with others. That was a caveat that was put in to protect, in a way, the status quo, both in places where things are going well and places where things are not going so well. So the most obvious example would say be the ability of women to work in Muslim countries, so if women in general are not allowed to work, or girls are not, and another example, girls are not allowed to go to school beyond 14 in some countries, like in Afghanistan right now, then you wouldn't expect women with disabilities or girls with disabilities to be able to do that. So there was a real push by countries that wanted limitations to include that phrase in many places where they thought it was a factor, so that they wouldn't have to do more than they already were doing or do things that they didn't agree with. The prohibition against discrimination is reflected throughout. And it includes all elements of employment, and the text was taken from the ADA. The labor union access was interesting, and it was handled required a lot of negotiation, because they wanted something that everybody could live with, because obviously some places are not crazy about labor unions, whereas others it's a very common thing and they're very active. So that's why you see that reference in there. A thing that was important to me especially was the idea that people with disabilities have access to regular or general vocational and technical training, not just specialized for people with disabilities, but actually go where other people are. In fact, I wrote a little booklet for the International Labor Organization way back in, I don't know, 2014 on that very topic, how to do it. And it's very popular and it's been translated into a lot of languages. It deals with some of the, I shouldn't use the word softer, but some of the simple, they're not simple, important aspects of employment, like the idea of searching for a job. You got to help people look for a job. You have to help people stay in a job. You have to help people return to a job once they lose it, if they lose a job, and you also have to create opportunities for people to advance. Again, these are all concepts that are reflected in the ADA, and we thought they were important to include in this article. Self-employment was highlighted, and you say, well, you know, that's great, but you know, why? Well, what you have is the International Labor Organization. I don't know whether they're still doing it now, but I know they were back when the ADA was being, when the treaty was being developed. Their strategy is to send their disability representatives around the world to secure money from embassies and governments to help people in developing countries that have disabilities to partner with somebody who is a successful entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur teaches them how to weave baskets or to develop some other product and to maintain their books and to know what prices to set. And they kind of pair these people and they pay this successful entrepreneur to work with the person with disability so they can also develop the skill. And what they try to do is they do it in a place where there is a market for the product and they're not competing with the entrepreneur that already exists. So I think that was one of the reasons why the emphasis, by making it its very own sentence or very own clause, was included in the article. The business about, you can see the distinction between public and private employment. They're saying you should provide public employment, and it would be nice if the private sector did the same thing. What you have in many countries, especially developing countries, is a quota system, which is not the best. For example, the government will pass a law that says, those of you in the private sector, 5% of your employees have to be disabled. And they thought that would be an incentive. And what has happened is, what accompanies law like this is the idea of the buy out of it. So if you don't meet the 5% quota, you pay a penalty or a fine of so many, so much money to get out of it. So in some respects, that has backfired a little bit with regard to the use of quotas. Another thing that we included was obviously important, reasonable accommodation. Again, that came from the ADA. Work experience in the real world. So many people with disabilities are isolated, maintained in sheltered workshop environments, not given opportunities for internships or apprenticeships or just work sampling in the real world. We thought it was important to include that in there. And then finally, the use of verbs. You notice in this article, some places they say, you shall do this. In other places, it's we recommend that you promote or we urge you to do this. So those distinctions reflect the tensions that were there and the compromises that were reached so as not to bring everybody into the fold so we could get finished with this article.
Thank you so much for all the insight, Dr. Morrissey. I would definitely love to have more in-depth discussion with you regarding to that, but unfortunately, we only have about 4 minutes left, and I can see that from our Q&A section, we do have 2 questions here, so let me just bring it up real quick. So We have a question from Teresa saying that it seems like the 67 senator bar is a difficult one to reach now and maybe ever. Are there any efforts to meet with the homeschooling lobby and or senators who may have the wrong idea about the treaty to talk through some of these issues and counter misconceptions?
You're right, 67 is a high bar. But I'm not saying that we have to assume that all Republicans are going to oppose it. You know, the composition of the Senate now is very different than it was in 2014. There is, I acknowledge, there is a great partisanship being expressed across the board. So I think that by people sharing with senators now, things that are going on in their various programs, maybe doing some photo opportunities for them, you know, in vocational rehabilitation environments, making them a partner on something that has nothing to do with the CRPD, and then approaching them later when we decide that it's worth attempting the CRPD ratification again. You have a relationship established. I think what people have to recognize is that there's, you know, there are a few things that any elected politician wants. They want votes, obviously. They want credit. They want recognition, and they want distinction. And obviously, disability-related topics are not something that Republicans automatically would embrace if they have no education about it or relationship about it. I worked most of my adult life for Republicans. And what I found is that, and I was very successful, what I found was that Democrats, generally speaking, have to support everything. So the assumption is made that in that case, you have to spend your time getting them to elevate your interests to a higher level than all the other interests they have to support. And that is in and of itself challenging. On the Republican side, they have an interest in knowing that programs work well, and that money is being used well, and that something positive results. And if you can get a Republican to become connected and associated with a disability issue, that allows them to be distinguished among their colleagues, okay, and reflect the leadership role in that topic. But it doesn't happen overnight. You have to build it. But once you have it for life. I mean, you have it forever. Whereas on the Democratic side, there's always going to be continuing pressure to bump something down, move something up, if you know what I mean. So what I urge you all to do is find, you know, go to your senators and your representatives, both at the state level and the federal level, and get them exposed to something that you're doing. Give them a photo op, write a story in your local paper about that event, give them an award, make sure you stay connected with them, develop a relationship with somebody that works for them in the state, and then ideally with time, make your way up to somebody in the Washington office. And then when we do reach the point where we are going to move on the CRPD, and I know who you are that are involved with these people, I can tell you, and then you can contact them and maybe make them supportive for us, because I don't think historically disability-related topics have not been a negative one, or a partisan one, and they need not be in the future. But we have to be smart about how we bring it about.
Thank you for watching Embracing the Difference Globally, the Ability Event.